The Scarab's engine had a sound like a man clearing his throat before a lie, low, wet, reluctant. Rena Malik loved it anyway. She was under the chassis at Eero 300 hours, colony standard, with a magnetic wrench in one hand and a half-eaten flatbread balanced on her sternum. Hydraulic fluid had stained her forearms to the elbows. The overhead light in Bay 7 flickered every 40 seconds with the reliability of an old argument, and somewhere in the upper scaffolding of Casbah Station, her son Danny was supposed to be asleep. She knew he wasn't. She could hear him humming. The song was the one she'd taught him when he was 3. A half-remembered melody her own mother used to hum while she did Rena's hair. No words anymore. Just the shape of it, passed hand to hand like a stone worn smooth by water. Danny hummed it whenever he couldn't sleep, which lately was often. She slid out from under the Scarab and looked up at him. He was sitting on the access ladder above Bay 7's second platform, legs dangling, watching her with the enormous patience of a 7-year-old who has learned that watching is sometimes enough. "Go to bed," she said. "I'm not tired." "I know. Go anyway." He climbed down instead. She didn't stop him. He sat on an overturned coolant drum and watched her eat the rest of the flatbread. She watched him back. He had her husband's eyes, dark, steady, slightly too serious for a child, and her own hands, already calloused from helping in the workshop. He picked up a torque driver and turned it over, the way he always did with tools. Not playing, just handling, learning the weight of things. "Is the Scarab ready?" he asked. "Not yet. Is it going to be ready?" "Yes, for the Crucible?" She hesitated a half-second too long. He was 7, he noticed. "Your father's going to worry if he finds you down here," she said. "Papa's at the coordination office." Danny set the torque driver down. "He's always at the coordination office now, since you got the bracket." Rena didn't answer that. She wiped her hands on a shop rag and looked at the Scarab. Really looked at it. 11 tons of reconfigured mining exosuit, beetle-shaped by design and by accident. Its carapace plating a patchwork of salvaged alloy she'd spent 4 years collecting from dead claims across the Tamsite belt. The legs were articulated excavation arms she'd rejointed for combat torque. The mandibles were plasma cutters, repurposed. The whole machine moved like something alive because she'd tuned the locomotion matrix herself, teaching it to walk the way she walked. Low center of gravity, weight forward, always ready to pivot. It was not a weapon. She had made it into one anyway. "Go to bed, Danny," she said again, quietly this time. He went. She listened to his footsteps fade up the scaffolding stairs and kept working. The engine complained. She complained back. Outside the viewport, Casbah Station's ring rotated slowly against the dark, and beyond it, the Tamsite belt drifted in its long ellipse around a star that humans had named, in their way, after a word in a language. 3 of them still spoke. Rena Malik was the best mechanic in the belt, and the 14th-ranked mecha combatant in the Human Colonial League, which meant she was approximately the 10,000th best mecha combatant in the Velkrath Crucible, because the Velkrath did not count human rankings as a real number. They counted them the way humans counted children's drawings hung on walls. Patient, mild condescension. She had known this before she entered. She had entered anyway. The bracket notification had come 6 weeks ago, delivered by a Velkrath administrative drone that hovered outside her bay door, making a sound like a tuning fork. Rena had been elbow-deep in a coolant relay when Yusuf came running from the coordination office, out of breath, holding his handheld display like it had bitten him. "Rena," he said. She looked at him. The bracket dropped. He turned the display so she could see. "You drew the Reaper." She looked at the display for a long time. The tournament bracket was a luminous thing, rendered in the Velkrath's preferred visual language. Recursive spirals, color-coded by species, human entries displayed in the outermost ring like footnotes. Her entry point was a small amber circle. The line connecting it to the next round led to a circle so deeply crimson it was almost black. Veldara Scrix, Reaper class, undefeated in 11 seasons of the Crucible. Pilot of a Scorpion-class Apex mech that had dismantled 17 opponents in the ring, 3 of them fatally. No human had ever faced the Reaper in the bracket. The Velkrath oddsmakers didn't even have a line on the outcome. They simply listed it as outcome, expected. Yusuf was still looking at her. His face was doing the thing it did when he was afraid for her. She looked Exactly like the face he made when he was angry with her, which was something they'd had to figure out together in the early years of their marriage still sometimes got wrong. "I'm not withdrawing," she said. "I didn't say withdraw. Your face said it. My face is worried." He set the display down. "There's a difference." "There's not much of one." Rena, he pulled up a second stool and sat beside her, there in the grease and the flicker light, and he didn't say anything for a moment. That was one of the things she'd loved first about him, that he knew when silence did more work than words. "I have never once asked you to stop." "I know. Not when you entered the Colonial League. Not when you won the belt championship. Not when you petitioned to enter the Crucible." He turned the torque driver she'd left on the workbench, slowly, not looking at her. "I'm not asking you to stop now. I'm asking you to tell P you have a plan." She looked at the scarab. "I have a plan," she said. He nodded. He handed her the torque driver. He kissed her on the forehead and left to go back to the coordination office. And she heard his footsteps on the scaffolding stairs and thought about the song, the one with no words left. And she turned back to the machine. She did not at that moment have a plan. What she had instead was 6 weeks and a problem she couldn't torque her way out of. Velcrath Scorpion-class Apex weighed 38 tons and moved like something that had evolved to kill. The Velcrath built their mechs the same way they built everything, by starting with violence and refining outward. The Apex's tail cannon could punch through 4 centimeters of hardened alloy at range. Its paired pincer arms exerted 1,200 kilopascals of crush pressure. Its locomotion system used 16 independent limb drives calibrated to the Velcrath pilot's nervous system, had 11 discrete sensory channels compared to the human 5. The scarab weighed 11 tons. Its plasma mandibles were good for cutting. Its armor would hold against light strikes and not much more. Rena spent the first week building models, not physical models. She built them in her head, the way she'd always thought, tating and stress testing, imagined configurations of force and angle and timing while her hands did other things. She calculated approach vectors. She mapped the Apex's attack patterns from Crucible footage, 11 seasons of it, studying the way Veldara Skrix moved his machine the way a person studies an old scar, not to mourn it but to understand it. She found 2 things. The first was that the Apex was almost perfectly optimized for frontal combat. Its tail cannon required a minimum 60-degree field of fire. Its pincer arms had a dead zone of approximately 40 centimeters at extreme close quarters. Too close for the full crush, too far for the tail to depress. The zone existed because the Velcrath body plan didn't easily accommodate that spatial compromise. They weren't built to hold something too close to strike. The second thing she found was that Veldara Skrix always finished fights the same way. Not identically, he was too skilled for that, but the rhythm was the same. He pushed, he cornered. He waited for the panic reaction, the desperate lateral movement, and he punished it. He had beaten 17 opponents by teaching them to run and then making them pay for running. He had never faced something that wouldn't run. She went back to the scarab and she started cutting. The second week she pulled the frontal carapace entirely and rebuilt it 60% thicker on the leading edge, sacrificing the width. She reconfigured the mandible actuators for a new movement she called the fold. A rapid inward collapse that brought the scarab's entire forward, massed down into a single dense wedge, like a beetle pulling its legs under itself. It reduced mobility for 3 seconds, and then dramatically increased it when the legs re-extended. She practiced the timing until she could execute the fold in 0.8 seconds. The third week she worked on the legs. She replaced 2 of the standard excavation joints with articulated pivot assemblies she sourced from a decommissioned terraforming unit, slower on straightaways, much faster in rotation. The scarab could now change direction in a tighter arc than any mech in the Colonial League. The 4th week she worked on the engine, the one that sounded like a man clearing his throat before a lie. She didn't fix the sound. She tuned the output instead, pushing the thermal envelope higher than the manufacturer had ever intended. Secondary heat dispersal through the dorsal plating that would run hot enough to interfere with the Apex's proximity sensors at close range. A narrow window, maybe 4 seconds. 4 seconds was enough if you knew what to do with them. The 5th week she tested. She ran the Scarab against drone simulators at full contact, alone in the bay after Danny was asleep, the machine learning the new shapes she'd given it, her learning to pilot it again at the edge of its new capabilities. She fell 3 times. Third fall. Cracked 2 of the pivot assemblies she'd just installed, and she spent 6 hours in the middle of the night replacing them, crying from exhaustion and something that wasn't quite fear, humming the song with no words to herself in the dark. Yusuf found her there at 0500. He didn't say anything about the crying. He poured coffee from a thermos he'd brought and sat on the overturned coolant drum and handed her a cup, and they sat together until the light through the viewport shifted from the cold black of rotation night to the pale amber of the star. "Tell me the plan," he said. She told him. He listened all the way through without interrupting. That was the other thing she'd loved about him first. The heat dispersal, he said when she finished. 4 seconds, 3 to 4, depending on what he does when I close. And if he doesn't move the way you expect, then I improvise. He looked at her for a long moment. That's not a plan. That's a plan with a door at the end. All plans have a door at the end, she said. The good ones just have the door somewhere you chose. The crucible was built into the hull of a decommissioned Volcrath, dreadnought the size of a small moon, which the Velcrath had converted to a tournament venue, the way some species convert stadiums. With absolute conviction that the purpose was evidently correct. The arena floor was 300 meters across, open-ceilinged to a viewport dome that showed the stars, because the Velcrath liked to fight under open sky even when there was no sky. The walls were smooth obsidian composite, curved inward at the top to prevent wall climbing. The air was tuned to Velcrath standard, slightly high in nitrogen, slightly low in oxygen. Not enough to debilitate a human. Enough to remind one. Rena arrived with Yusuf and Danny, and 47 other humans from stations across the belt. It was approximately 47 more human spectators than the Velcrath had expected. Word had gotten out that one of theirs was in the bracket. The colonial network had done what colonial networks do. It had talked, and the talk had pulled people across distances that didn't make practical sense. Danny held her hand in the staging area. He was wearing his good shirt. He'd combed his hair himself, which meant it was slightly wrong in a way that made her chest ache. "Are you scared?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He considered this with the seriousness he applied to everything. "Good scared or bad scared?" "I don't know yet. Ask me after." He nodded like this was a satisfactory answer. Then he said, "The Scarab is the best one, I know, even against the Scorpion." She looked at him. He looked back with his father's steady eyes, and her own calloused hands, and the song they shared that had no words left, just shape. "Especially against the Scorpion," she said. She didn't know if it was true. She said it anyway, and the saying of it did something in her chest. Not made it true, exactly, but made it possible. There was a difference. She'd learned the difference from Yusuf. The Velcrath marshals called the combatants to the staging bay. She kissed Danny on the top of his head. She shook Yusuf's hand, which was a thing they did before fights, because Huthungin felt like saying goodbye. She walked into the bay. She climbed into the Scarab. The cockpit smelled like machine oil, and the particular metallic warmth of a system she'd tuned herself, and underneath those smells, faintly, the cold iron scent of the flatbread she'd eaten in this cockpit 100 times. Crumbs. Danny left when she let him sit in the pilot's chair. She ran her pre-fight checklist not because she needed to. She knew the system's state the way she knew her own breathing, but because the ritual of it settled something in her that needed settling. Hydraulics. Nominal. Motion. Nominal. Fold actuators. Armed and responsive. Thermal dispersal standing by. Plasma mandibles charged. Engine running hot. Exactly as intended. Complaining in its low wet way. She put her hands on the control surfaces and closed her eyes for 3 seconds. She thought about the song. Just the shape of it. The weight of a stone worn smooth. She opened her eyes. The bay doors opened. The Velcrath crowd made a sound that wasn't quite sound. A subsonic resonance that lived in the sternum rather than the ears, which was how they expressed collective anticipation. The arena floor was lit from beneath, casting everything in pale blue-white, and the dome above showed stars in their millions. And the Scarab walked out into it, and for a moment Rena felt very small. Then she saw the apex, and the feeling changed. It was enormous. Not just large, enormous in the way of things that have been built to be looked at, to announce themselves by size alone. 38 tons of Velcrath engineering. Glossy black carapace with articulated segments along the spine, the tail cannon elevated and tracking, the pincer arms extended, and she recognized from the footage as Veldera Skrix's opening stance. The invitation, "Come to me, let me show you what I am." The Velcrath pilot sat in the Apex's exposed command pod, mid-thorax, in a configuration that put the pilot's sensory array directly into the machine's nervous system. She'd studied images of Veldera Skrix. 8 limbs, folded now. A body plan that was simultaneously insectoid and something else entirely. Something that had its own word in the Velcrath language, didn't translate, that referred to a category of living thing that had evolved past needing to be afraid. Apex Predator didn't cover it. There was no human word. The Velcrath crowd pulsed its subsonic sound again. Rena ran the fold. Just once, a quick test. The scarab's carapace dropped, the legs tucked. The machine compressed itself into a dense low wedge for 0.8 seconds, and then re-extended. She felt it respond cleanly. Good. Veldera Skrix did not react. He simply watched her from whatever the Velcrath equivalent of curiosity was, and the patience of it was the most unsettling thing in the arena. He had done this 11 seasons. He knew what panic looked like. He was waiting for the shape of it to show up in her movement. She gave him a different shape instead. She walked the scarab directly toward him, charging, walking, the same gait she used when she crossed the bay floor at 0300 hours, going from the workbench to the engine, unhurried, purposeful. The gait of someone who knew where they were going, because they'd already been there in their head 1,000 times. The Apex's tail cannon depressed, tracking. She kept walking. At 120 meters, the tail cannon fired. She had been watching for the pre-fire tell, 0.3-second tension in the tail's anterior segment that showed up in every clip of Veldera Skrix she ever studied. She saw it. She had already begun the lateral rotation before the round left the cannon. The scarab's tighter pivot arc brought her 40 degrees off the fire line in the time it took the round to cross the distance. It missed by 6 meters. The Velcrath crowd went very quiet. This was, she suspected, not what they'd expected in the opening 30 seconds. Veldera Skrix reconfigured. The Apex shifted its stance, lowering its profile, bringing the tail into a shorter deployment angle that would make the next shot harder to read. He was adapting. She'd known he would. He had 11 seasons of adaptation. She used the time he spent adapting to close another 40 meters, 80 meters. She was inside the range, where the tail cannon's trajectory became awkward. Not safe. Nothing at this range was safe, but the geometry was working the way she'd calculated. He could still fire. He would have to elevate, compensate. It would cost him 0.4 seconds more per shot. She ran the fold. The scarab dropped into its wedge, carapace angled forward, and the tail shot, that was already mid-trajectories, skated off the angled armor at a deflection that sent it into the arena wall. Rena felt the impact in her teeth and her hands and the base of her spine, full body sensation of something enormous, hitting something that refused to give. And she loved the machine then with a clarity that had nothing to do with sentiment. She re-extended and kept closing. 60 meters. 50. The Apex's pincer arms were reaching for her, and she felt the geometry changing. The dead zone was almost in range, but she needed to be inside. 20 meters to use it. And there were 40 meters of Velcrath precision engineering between her and that point. He caught her. One pincer slammed into the scarab's port side, with a force that lifted 4 legs off the arena floor and sent her sideways. Rotational assist in the new pivot assemblies was the only reason she didn't go fully over. She found the floor again, with a bone jar that popped a warning light on the structural monitoring system. And she was already pushing back before she fully processed the impact. The dorsal plating was running hot. She checked the thermal readout. Not yet. 45 seconds before the heat dispersal reached the interference threshold. She didn't have 45 seconds. She made a decision. She threw the scarab at the Apex's left pincer arm. Not a strike, not a charge. She ran the fold mid-approach and used the 0.8-second compression to turn herself into a dense wedge, and she hit the pincer arm from the inside. At the joint, everything the scarab's leading edge could deliver. The fold release drove all 11 tons back into motion at the moment of contact, the locomotion matrix pushing through the impact instead of absorbing it, and she felt the joint crumple. Not break. The Velcraft engineering didn't break easily, but deform. The articulation compromised, the full crush pressure down to maybe 60%. The apex responded by bringing the tail around in a configuration she hadn't seen in the footage. New. Improvised. Veldara Skrix, adapting in real time to a problem he'd never encountered. This was the moment she'd planned for, and feared in equal measure. When the opponent stopped fighting the fight they expected and started fighting the fight in front of them. Because now she was improvising too, and the question was, who was better at it? She thought, 11 seasons of winning teaches you what works. 4 weeks in a bay at 300 hours teaches you what almost works and why. She pushed inside. She got the scarab to 11 meters, 9, and the dead zone opened up around her and the tail cannon swept overhead, seeking an angle and finding none, and the heat dispersal on the dorsal. Plating crossed the threshold. 4 seconds. The apex's proximity sensors went white. She knew it from the way the pincer arms hesitated. Half a second of sensory gap. The Velcraft pilot flying partially blind in a machine tuned to his nervous system. A system that was currently telling him conflicting things about what was in front of him. Half a second was not 4 seconds. She'd said 3 to 4. It was 2.5. She used all of it. She drove the plasma mandibles into the junction between the apex's command pod and its thorax housing, not to cut through. She didn't have the power for that, but to cut the external sensor array. The fin that fed the pilot's closed-loop awareness of the machine's structural state. She'd found it in the technical specifications that the Velcraft Tournament Authority published for registered combatants, buried in a document she'd had to request in 3 languages and 2 bureaucratic appeals, a document that was 1,400 pages long and which she had read in full over 11 nights while Yusuf and Danny slept. The array went dark. The apex's feedback to its pilot went partially blind. The machine was still functional. Veldara Skrix was still dangerous. He knew it too. She could see it in the way the apex moved, suddenly more deliberate, compensating for the gap in its sensory return. A pilot, who had never had to fight his machine from memory, now doing exactly that. She backed off to 30 meters and walked the scarab in a slow circle. He tracked her. The tail cannon moved, but without the array. The targeting was manual, approximated, and she was moving in the tight arcs that the new pivot assemblies made possible, that were genuinely hard to track by eye. He fired twice. The first shot came close. The second was off by 12 meters. She kept circling. The Velcraft crowd was silent in a way that she'd never heard a crowd be silent. Not the silence of boredom or contempt. The silence of something unexpected. Something that didn't have a shape yet in the available language. She was aware of it. The way she was aware of the engine running hot and the warning light still blinking, and Danny somewhere up in the dome with his father, watching this with those steady dark eyes. She did not look up. She kept circling. She kept making him track. She waited for the moment when the compensation started to cost him more than he could spend. It came at 4 minutes and 11 seconds from her entry into the dead zone. The tail cannon's traverse slowed by 0.7 seconds on a leftward sweep. Cumulative fatigue in the manual tracking, the cost of piloting at partial awareness showing in the machine's movement. She'd seen it in the footage with the third opponent, Season 9. Veldara Skrix did not lose focus, but he could be made to spend it, and spent focus left a seam. She drove into the seam. She hit the apex's tail from the inside, at the cannon junction, with the scarab's full forward momentum and a fold release timed to multiply it. The cannon crumpled at the joint. It didn't detach, it twisted, locking the tail in a fixed elevated position that left it unable to depress back into combat range. Veldara Skrix had no tail. He had a compromised pincer. He had no sensor array. He had his own body's knowledge of his machine and 4.5 minutes of accumulated disorientation in a fight that had not gone any direction he'd prepared for. He had 11 seasons of winning. He didn't have what she had. She circled again. 3 circuits. Slow. Letting him know she could do this indefinitely. Letting the math sit in the arena floor between them. At the end of the 3rd circuit, the apex stopped moving. The Velcraft Tournament Authority had a gesture for concession. The pilot raised 2 of the mech's limbs to a specific angle that indicated voluntary withdrawal from the match. Rena had seen it in footage. She had never expected to see it directed at her. She watched Veldara Skrix raise the Apex's compromised arms to the angle anyway. The arena went still for a moment that seemed to take longer than it was. Then, the 47 humans in the gallery made a sound that was nothing like the Velkrath's subsonic resonance. It was louder and more chaotic and entirely specific, and she heard Danny's voice in it. Not his words, just his voice, pitch of it when he was surprised by joy. And she put her head down in the cockpit and breathed. The engine complained, low and wet, and she patted the control surface. "I know," she said. "Me too." Veldara Skrix requested a post-match exchange through the tournament authority. It was unusual enough that the Velkrath officials noted it formally in the match record. Rena agreed. They met in the neutral corridor outside the staging bays, both of them on foot. Both of them shorter than their machines had been. He was six-limbed at rest. She noticed the other two retracted. He smelled like ozone and something she didn't have a word for. He stood in front of her for a moment without using the translation interface. Then he activated it. "The sensor array," he said. "Yes. You found it in the technical specifications." "Yes. No one reads those specifications." He said this without accusation, more like someone noting the solution to a problem that had seemed unsolvable. "They are 1,400 pages. I read them over 11 nights." He was still for a moment in the way that the Velkrath were still when they were thinking. Not frozen, consolidated. Something happening inward that didn't need outward expression. Then he made a gesture she didn't know. "My language doesn't have a word for what you did," the translation interface said. "A beat late. The closest is a term we use for the strategy of a prey animal that has studied its predator long enough to stop being prey. It is not usually considered a compliment among my kind." "Is it a compliment from you?" He was still again then. "Yes." She nodded. She thought about saying something about what it felt to be the species that the galaxy's dominant powers didn't count as a real number. She decided not to. He knew, any pilot knew. "Your machine," he said. "The beetle, the scarab. It moves like something alive." "It does," she said. "I tuned it that way." How she thought about the bay at A300, the flatbread on her sternum, and the flickering light, and Danny humming the song on the scaffolding above her. Shh. The way she'd talked to the engine when it complained, and the way it complained back, and the 4 weeks of nights she'd spent teaching the machine to move the way she moved. "I spent a lot of time with it," she said. "I learned what it was before I started making it into what I needed." He processed this through the translation interface, with a slight delay that she suspected was genuine, not a translation lag, something that didn't have a ready shape in his language. "We build differently," he said finally. "I know. We start with the outcome. The machine must do. We optimize toward that." "And you're very good at it," she said. "Yes. No false modesty." She respected that. "You start from the machine." "I start from what's there," she said, "and I work out to what's possible." He was still for the last time. Then he turned and walked back into the Velkrath corridor. She watched him go. 6 limbs. Then 8, as the retracted pair unfolded for the longer gate. And she thought that there were at least 2 kinds of strength in the universe. And one of them read 1,400-page specification documents over 11 nights, and cried from exhaustion in the dark and hummed songs that had lost their words. Yusuf was waiting outside the neutral corridor with Danny on his back, asleep, one small calloused hand fisted in his father's collar. The boy had apparently fought very hard against falling asleep and lost. It was a fight Rena recognized. Yusuf put his free arm around her. She leaned into him. They stood there for a while, the 3 of them, in the corridor of a decommissioned Velkrath, dreadnought under a dome of stars. "Tell me about the door at the end of the plan," he said quietly, as not to wake Danny. "I opened it," she said. "What was on the other side?" She thought about it. The arena floor lit from beneath. Proud silence finding a new shape. The engine's complaint and her answer to it. "Another plan," she said. He laughed, the low, quiet laugh that he saved for late hours and good news, and the spaces between things that mattered. She felt it more than heard it. Danny stirred on his father's back without waking and hummed 3 notes of the song, the middle 3, the ones she thought of as the hinge of it, place where the melody turned. and then was quiet again. She reached up and tucked his hand more firmly into Yusuf's collar. The scarab was in the staging bay. It needed work. The structural warning light, the cracked pivot assembly she'd felt give in the third minute, dorsal plating that had run so hot she'd need to pull the heat dispersal unit and rebuild it from the junction. 2 weeks of work, maybe 3. She was already designing the rebuild in the back of her head, rotating in stress, testing the configuration, finding the places where she could make it better than it had been. She always could. That was the thing about starting from what was there. There was always more there than you'd seen the last time. They walked back through the crucible toward the docking ring, past Velcrath officials who watched them with expressions she couldn't fully read and didn't need to, past the 47 humans from stations across the belt who were still making noise. A specific human noise, the kind that had no formal category. That was partly pride, and partly disbelief, and partly the pure animal pleasure of watching something work out against the numbers. Rena walked through the noise, and it settled around her, like something worn smooth by water. She thought about her mother braiding her hair. She thought about Danny on the scaffolding, turning tools in his hands to learn their weight. She thought about the engine, low and wet and reluctant, and the way she'd talked to it, and it had talked back. She thought about the 1,400-page document she'd read over 11 nights. There were other brackets, other seasons, other machines she hadn't met yet, other specifications she hadn't read, for other pilots who had never faced something that wouldn't run. She was already thinking about what came next. She was always already thinking about what came next. That was, Veldara Scrix had said, not usually a compliment among his kind. It was among hers.